So we're going to be going over Chapter 8 on political geography. If you look at the map in the beginning of the chapter, it shows you the areas we'll be talking about primarily. So you should be familiar with these areas. So in the United States, we'll be talking about New York, Iowa, and Nevada. We'll be talking about Greenland and Denmark. We'll be talking about the Arctic, Monaco, Slovenia, and Moldova. In Europe, we'll be talking about Russia, North and South Korea, Taiwan, Tora Bora, the Caucasus Mountains, Cyprus, Antarctica, Western Sahara, and Cuba. Chapter 8, Key Issue 1 is about where states are distributed. So we'll talk about the areas of rapid growth and UN membership. We'll talk about why it's difficult to determine if some territories are states. And we'll explain the concept of a nation state, how it differs from earlier ways to govern. So a state is an area organized into a political unit and ruled by an established government, and it has control over its internal and foreign affairs. So it occupies a defined territory and has a permanent population. And like we talked about in Chapter 7, a state has sovereignty, which means it's independent from control of its internal affairs by other states. This is why the definition of state in world politics and geopolitics is different than what we think of states in the United States. So like the state of Florida, Florida is not sovereign. It's not independent from control of its internal affairs because the federal government has jurisdiction and can override decisions made at the state level, right? So the state in this term is our entire country, the United States. So when we're talking about states in geography, unless we're specifically talking about, an independent like Florida or Georgia, unless it's referring to, a state within the United States. When we're talking about states in general, we're talking about what we would think of as a country. It's sovereign. It has a territory. It has a population that lives there permanently, so it's part of the world's ecumen, right? And it decides its own rule of law. The United Nations was created at the end of World War II, and the purpose was for them to serve as a facilitator for discussions regarding international problems. The idea was that perhaps the United Nations could prevent a third world war. And it kind of built off Woodrow Wilson's idea from after World War I, the League of Nations, which never really took off. So the UN has intervened in conflicts between or within member states, but it's also just a place for people to try to sort out grievances in a peaceful manner. They also have a panel on climate change we'll be talking about, and they have a panel on development, and that's who would have developed the Sustainable Development Goals that we talked about last week. The UN membership has increased rapidly on 3 distinct occasions. In 1955, 16 European countries joined as a result of the Nazi Germany breakup, so that was in its early days. In 1960, 17 mostly former African colonies joined. And in the 1960s, most of the sovereign states in Africa were kind of just being established, so it makes sense that you would have a rapid growth in membership then. And then from 1990 to 1993, we had 26 countries join. And they joined as a result of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia breakup. So because these were big multinational states, once they broke up and these independent areas became sovereign states, we had an increase in membership again. So we went from 2 places to 26 places. If you look at this map here in your book, it shows you a map of the UN and its members. And you can see that the gray areas are non-members. So if you look through, you won't see many non-members, but like Taiwan, because there's arguments about whether it's a sovereign state or if it's part of China. So because that dispute's going on, it's a non-member. And you can see the original members. There were 51 original members. Russia at the time was the Soviet Union. In the 1940s, we had 8 added. In the 1950s, we added 24. In the 1960s, 42 more were added, etc. South Sudan is our newest member. So what are the challenges in defining what a state is or what a state isn't? Disagreement exists about the actual number of sovereign states because of historical disputes involving more than one claim to a territory. Um, so, like I just mentioned on the last page with the map, is in China, most countries consider China, the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan as separate and sovereign states. But the Chinese government considers Taiwan a part of China. And so, because of that conflict, um, Taiwan is not often internationally recognized by heads of state as a sovereign state itself. Another place is Western Sahara. Most African countries consider Western Sahara as a sovereign state. However, Morocco claimed the territory and says it belongs to them. And they built a wall around it to keep the rebels out. So Western Sahara, because of the dispute there, you won't sometimes see it recognized as a sovereign state until it's sorted out. So here's the wall built to keep rebels out. What are their challenges in defining a state? Other areas like the polar region. So there's lots of different states that claim a portion of the South Pole region as belonging to them. So Argentina claims part of it, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the UK. Some claims in the South Pole region are overlapping and conflicting. So Argentina, Chile, and the United Kingdom, they all have areas that overlap. The US, Russia, and many other states do not recognize claims to Antarctica because you don't have a permanent population settled there, right? So it doesn't kind of fit in with the idea of established territories, sovereign rule, and a permanent population. So it doesn't really fit the definition of state, but people still want to claim territory there for fishing rights and possible mineral rights. In 1982, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea permitted countries to submit claims inside the Arctic Circle as long as they did so by 2009. So within the Arctic Circle, you have people submitting, here's Antarctica, and you can see the claims. And then you can see the areas that were submitted in the Arctic Circle. So here's Denmark, right? And they submit their complaint. Their claim lays all the way out to here. Iceland's a little bit smaller. Norway. Russia claims all of this. The United States through Alaska claims this part. Canada claims this part. And then here in the middle of this area is all disputed as being part of the United States, Canada, Russia, or Denmark, or a little Norway thrown in there. And this matters because they're in the Arctic Circle, again, fishing rights and potential oil and mineral rights. So where do we get the idea of a state? The idea of a state, like the idea of like a sovereign nation independent from others, this idea traces back to the Fertile Crescent. The first states were really known as city-states, and these were sovereign states that were comprised of towns and their surrounding countryside. So the first states weren't large countries, they were little city-states. And you probably, if you learned about city-states in history class, it was usually in reference to, I think Italy is probably the one you would have learned about, because I think most famous for its city-states. So these little city-states had a ruler, usually a noble. They had walls that delineated their boundaries, and the area outside the walls was used by, it was like an agricultural area that was used to produce food for the urban residents. In the medieval times, that's when you would have heard about the Italian city-states, you had military dominance of individual city-states that eventually led to the formation of empires like the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, its land was parceled up, and then again it was controlled by various monarchies, so the rise of the city-state again in Italy. The concept of nation-states, like we were talking about, a nation-state is really a territory that corresponds to that occupied by a particular ethnicity. And again, we know from Chapter 7 that the idea that these ethnicities have the right to govern themselves is known as self-determination. So if you are considering yourself a nation, you want a legal status to govern yourself. And if you are a country with boundaries and, self-rule, you're sovereign and you have a permanent population, and you are comprised of mostly one ethnic group, you are a nation state. And this idea kind of rose up in Europe. So after World War I, leaders of various countries met at the Versailles Peace Conference, and they redrew the map of Europe. The language was used as the most important criterion to establish new European states and to adjust existing boundaries. The nation states that were created by the Versailles Conference have lasted through most of the 20th century with little adjustment. So most of the countries we see today were the ones that were established at that Versailles Conference. So in the 1800s, we had the French Empire, we had Spain, Portugal. Italy was broken up into different little nations, like independent states. We had Naples, we had Sardinia, we had Austria, which was huge. We had the Holy Roman Empire. We had Prussia, the Ottoman Empire, and then the Russian Empire, and then Denmark and Norway. And then we had the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, which today is the United Kingdom because they came together and were united, and Ireland is an independent state. If you look at the map after the Versailles Conference, you see it looks a lot more like it does today. So this area, the USSR, Yugoslavia, this area looks different because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia after the Cold War. So Eastern Europe looks a little different, but most of Western Europe looks pretty much the same. You have Germany, Switzerland, Australia, the Netherlands, Belgium. So many of these countries weren't even in existence in 1800. And that's it for Key Issue 1.